Once again, I'm Justin Chang. This is Kenneth Turan, and before we get started, I just wanted to say, Kenny, I'm just honored to be on this stage with you.
Justin.
I know, I don't have to do this, but I kind of do. I just have to say, because I think I speak for a lot of us here in Los Angeles, I consider Kenneth Turan to be my first and still best teacher on film and film criticism. I've been fortunate enough to have studied with him, been mentored by him, written alongside him at the LA Times for 4 years. Kenny is just the most companionable of critics in reading your wonderful book. I felt schooled and dazzled and entertained all over again, and I really can't recommend your book enough to those here who may not have read it yet. And I just think being here in LA film culture owes you so much. So thank you and congratulations to you, Kenny.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you. Now it's been wonderful working, along with you for all those years. Seriously, it's been great.
It really has. I mean, let's dive in. And why don't we start with Bombshell? I mean, it's especially interesting to watch this movie in light of reading your book and to see a satire of the Hollywood apparatus made by that apparatus in a way that's very self-skewering, but also very self-flattering in some ways. And I'm just curious too, is it true that this was originally intended as a more serious film before?
I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it came from a play, went through some iterations, and then I think you're correct. At a certain point, they decided to make it a comedy.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think you can see vestiges of that before the idea came in. I mean, and I was trying to place this just in the framework too. This was released in 1933, so this would have been one of the last films that Irving Thalberg oversaw before MGM was restructured and David O. Selznick was brought in, and he was kind of stripped of some of his power. Is that right? I mean,
yeah. And it's not clear how. It's just funny, to hear I think my favorite line in the whole film is the line about even Norma Shearer and Helen Hayes in their nicest pictures never had lines of dialogue like that. That's such a deft skewering of, And, it's funny. I mean, there's always been this dichotomy with MGM actresses where the actresses who were down in the trenches and who did a lot of work felt they weren't treated as well as other actresses. Judy Garland always felt that she was not treated as well as Greer Garson. And she would complain, why don't they treat me like Greer Garson? And it's the same thing. Here she's saying, Norma Shearer, Helen Hayes.
You get into this in your book, which is such I think a really incisive but also really sympathetic portrait of the MGM contract players and especially the actresses. I feel like we get to know them as well as anyone in the book, and that kind of almost the sense of them being the competition and them being almost pitted against each other. I mean, were Thalberg and Mayer very knowing about that, or keeping them kind of in?
The biggest competition, the legendary competition, is Norma Shearer and Joan Crawford, who came up together. In fact, I think in a very early film, I think one of them doubled for the other, uncredited. And Joan Crawford was they both were in their own way very competitive. And, Crawford kept kind of like leapfrogging each other. And then finally, Norma Shearer made the ultimate move and she married Thalberg. And I actually found it's a famous quote where to Bob Thomas, who wrote the original Thalberg biography, where someone gave me his interview notes from the interview. I think it was in the Cock and Bull restaurant, a local landmark, where Joan Crawford said to him, it was like an unfair labor competition. She sleeps with the boss. This isn't fair. It's a very plaintive complaint.
You mentioned this in your introduction. Want to talk a little bit about Jean Harlow, who died just 4 years after this movie was made, and was even younger than Thalberg, who was 36 when he died. And she had experienced, so much tragedy and scandal in her, even before, with the death of her husband, the MGM executive Paul Byrne. Can you talk just a little bit more about? I know you'd been a fan already, but just kind of what you discovered about her and her legacy through
Well,
research.
it was very poignant. I mean, it's not that, she had nothing against her self-image, but it wasn't her. She was very aware that it wasn't her. She didn't feel necessarily, you know, there's I don't think I can find it, but there in the book there's a quote that she gives to Time magazine. Actually, I think I can remember it. She was on the cover of Time magazine, not the first Hollywood person, but an early Hollywood person to be on the cover of Time. And they tell a story in the article that she's at a party and she makes a witty remark, and someone says to her, "Where'd you hear that from?" And she says, "Well, why is it that I have to wear a low-cut dress to be worthy of attention?" So there was a real poignance about, she liked, it's not even clear, frankly. I mean, she was so young, she didn't do that many interviews. It was her mother who wanted her to be a star. I think she was okay with it, but you never got the sense that she was burning with ambition. She was not Joan Crawford.
Kenny, I want to just dive back into, I guess, 5 years ago when you first started out writing this, and I know it's been a journey. So much has been written, of course, about the history of MGM and about Mayer and Thalberg, and we know because you've read and absorbed just about all of it yourself.
A lot, yeah.
Your book is rare, though, in the way it does put these two men on near equal footing, and it really cuts to the heart of how complementary and contradictory their talents were and their temperaments were. And was that the impetus for the book, kind of getting to the heart of that relationship?
I was curious about that relationship. I mean, initially, the Jewish Lives people had been interested in Mayer, but I was just more interested in the duality in Mayer and Thalberg. It was, I was fortunate that, when you don't know what you're going to find when you start to research. These people are interesting, but you don't really know what the dynamic is going to be, how it's going to play out. So I was fortunate that I felt that it did play out in the way you describe it. It's a very interesting dynamic between the two of them. They both loved each other and kind of drove each other crazy, I think, is one way to put it. It was just a fascinating relationship.
I mean, you start off with the book with Thalberg's death, his obituary, and you tell us that Mayer, not long after learning of that, he says, "Isn't God good to me?" Which is this, horribly callous thing to say.
Yeah.
But then you go on through the book, and especially toward the end, showing how conflicted his feelings were, and that this was a friend, a rival, and even a son to him.
Yeah. He was a world-class compartmentalizer, Mayer. I mean, he would say things that you wouldn't think the same person could say, let alone mean. But I came to feel that he meant all those things he said. He just meant them in the moment. They did not have carryover value. And so when he said that thing, which I think came from someone who was riding in the car with him coming back from Thalberg's funeral, I think he meant that. But on the other hand, there's a lot of scenes from the last days when Thalberg was dying, when he was really, they had a meeting, they had a heart-to-heart talk, they really kind of, made good on a lot of the bad feelings they had. They kind of healed each other. And I think that was genuine as well. I mean, I think one of the things that I wanted to feel and convey with this book is that these were people. They had good sides and bad sides. They did admirable things. They did things that were less than admirable. And to see, it all one way, to see it as Thalberg was the great guy and Mayer was a buffoon, or the other way around, that Thalberg was, Mayer was sincere and Thalberg was conniving. It's not accurate to see it that way. They were all both.
Yeah, I think one of the pleasures of reading the book is that it felt like this very kind of prismatic kind of where they kept cleaving to their characters in many ways, but you keep turning it over and revealing more complexities, exactly as you were saying. I mean, and, maybe Thalberg being the art, Mayer being the commerce, but that also feels reductive, and Mayer being very much an actor's, very sympathetic to actors, whereas Thalberg had this immaculate story sense that really endeared him to writers, but it does feel like they were complementary, or that the opposites in them attracted at almost every step.
Yeah, I think that's very much true. I mean, there's one of my favorite lines I read it's not in her book. Irene Mayer-Selznick, who is Louis B. Mayer's daughter and later married David O. Selznick. And she actually, it's not in her book. She wrote a wonderful memoir, one of the best memoirs of the period I've read, but this was in another interview. And she said, my father never loved anyone the way he loved Irving. You know, there was a quality of their attraction at the beginning that was quite strong. And there's some letters you read, telegrams they sent each other. This was a real, you know, sincere relationship, and it just didn't totally survive.
I know you've touched on some of the research already, but I can only imagine just the amount of it that went into a project like this. And I know you undertook it at the start of COVID, around then too. I mean, can you talk about just what that process was like, and where did you even begin?
Yeah, I mean, it was a challenge. It was a challenge doing it during COVID. I had some good luck, you know. One of the best pieces of good luck I had was that Leonard Maltin, who was a friend, said, you know, you should call Ned Comstock. And I said, who's Ned Comstock? And he said, Ned Comstock is the librarian at USC, the film librarian at USC. So I called him up, and he said, it's a great idea for a book. He says, I have one problem. I'm retiring. This is my last week. So I said, oh, my God. But he said, no, don't worry. You know, I'll send you some stuff. And in the, you know, aside from whatever else he did in his last week, he emailed me an astonishing amount of stuff. I mean, when you read, one of the things you become a student of when you do this is acknowledgments. And, you know, you read the acknowledgments in other histories. And every single one of them I started to see would end with, and a very special thank you to Ned Comstock. Ned Comstock was extraordinary. One of the things he said to me, which other people had seen, but I made more use of them, Thalberg was legendary for his story conferences. He really took scripts apart. It turned out for a lot of these, he had a stenographer, and there were transcribed records of his story conferences. And they were in the USC, and Ned Comstock emailed me a trove of these, you know, which, like I say, other people, I didn't discover them, other biographers had used them, but I used them more. I saw more in there. So Ned Comstock, who sadly is no longer with us, he was just an extraordinary man. And it was just a sheer luck that I got to him the last few days before he was gone.
Were there, I know when you're undertaking a project like this, you have things that are, I'm sure, guiding you, and you have a lot of knowledge already, but was there something particularly surprising that just you really weren't expecting in kind of the process of discovering?
Everyone, you know, again, you're fortunate when you do this. I mean, the less you know when you start, the better, because then you're surprised by things and you're not acting under preconceptions. But there was a quote, you know, that the quote from Mayer that you mentioned is one of the great quotes that I just came out of nowhere. Isn't God good to me? But there's also a quote a close associate of Thalberg said about Thalberg, and he said, you know, Irving's a good guy, but Irving can piss ice water. And, you know, we're just not used to thinking of Thalberg that way, you know. He just could be very, you know, just business, you know.
As fascinating as both these men are, and I'm glad that you gravitated toward Thalberg and kind of, you know, including them both, because to me he does emerge as the more compelling figure, and of course this is partly because he died young,
Yeah.
which we would never know. Well, maybe we can speculate. I mean, it's interesting to think what would have become of him, but just someone who was known as this boy genius, who had this instinct for how movies worked. And then his mystique was kind of forever cemented by his premature death. And just did that? I mean, was that how it kind of came about for you too? Kind of in looking at both these men side by side. I mean, I don't know. I guess it's a question of the structure. I guess finding the balance between them. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's the key, is finding a balance. You know, because you don't want. You know, I didn't want to make either one of them, you know, to say this guy is really, I mean, to me, that was sometimes in the Bible, when you read, you know, that both of them figure in the biographies of the other. You know, the Mayer biographies have a lot about Thalberg, the Thalberg biographies have a lot about Mayer, but it always feels that almost there's a little favoritism going on. You know, the Mayer biographies feel that Mayer's the more important guy, and the Thalberg biographies feel the opposite, and that's just only natural. And I just wanted to, like I say, I wanted to do slightly different. I use those books a lot. I read every single biography, and there's a lot of them, and they were very helpful. But I just wanted to find my own path.
One of the reasons I think Thalberg resonates for us, and you write about this in the book, is that he is championing this idea that I think feels almost utterly anathema to the studio mindset nowadays. This idea that it's groundbreaking, that movies should be good, and that in fact, and that good pictures would actually make good money, and that and you note in this book that he would be willing to spend more on reshoots and if it was worth it to him, and that does feel like something that I know it is many decades ago, but it does feel even more gone now than it did.
No, that's not happening anymore. But yeah, he would really he wanted to make good pictures better. I mean, he almost didn't care. Movies that were terrible, he felt they weren't necessarily worth more work. But he wanted to make great movies out of good movies, and he had just had this instinct more often than not how to do it. It's just, I mean, he's probably I don't know if there's ever been a studio executive since who people were happier to get his notes. People really seem to like his notes. I mean, like I say, you hear people say he was cold. You hear a lot of things about him that are not necessarily flattering, but I didn't come across anyone who said, this guy didn't know what he was doing. That you don't hear.
And the fact that we were talking about this, just the fact that he sort of shunned credits for himself, which also seems kind of unheard of now, but it was so involved and made good choices and made things better, but did not want it to be almost kind of an invisible player.
I mean, gradually, as his life went on, he found ways to get public. He kind of crept into the publicity, but he did a long time. He did a lot of work. When he just didn't care. He really didn't care. He really didn't care.
I know this book was written as part of the Jewish Lives series, and Meir, being of Russian Jewish descent, and had this immigrant background he was very ashamed of and tried to hide. And whereas Thalberg was born in Brooklyn to German Jewish parents, a much more assimilated family. What was it like exploring these two men and their very different relationships just to their Judaism and their Jewish heritage?
Yeah. I mean, I felt that they were the two poles of American Judaism at the time, and classically German Jews and Eastern European immigrants who came decades later and who were considered ne'er-do-wells by the German Jews, they didn't necessarily get along, and I found no reference of Meir and Thalberg ever talking about or considering the fact that they were from these opposite poles. But I just had to feel that this was a factor in their relationship, that they kind of, especially Meir. I mean, Meir was like an immigrant dealing with his American-born son. I mean, there were a lot of times when he would just, Meir always wanted more credit. What Thalberg wanted was more money for a variety of reasons. He never felt he was paid enough. And often, Meir, when they'd have these disputes, Meir would give in, and it really felt like the immigrant father kind of can't say no to his, his native-born son. It felt that way very much to me, even though no one ever said anything about it.
You write, too, of course, about their experiences of anti-Semitism in Hollywood, just in America, and how they dealt with it or didn't deal with it. I mean, even knowing the prevalence of anti-Semitism then and now and in the U.S., did the degree of it surprise you as you were?
Some of it did. I mean, there was the way that people, the way it was, the way it was it was accepted. There was stories that other people had pointed me towards them, but I made more use of them. Stories in the Saturday Evening Post, which at that time was the largest circulation magazine in the country. And there were a series of stories, one would run every couple of months, about a guy named Izzy Itzkowitz, who was very clearly based on Thalberg, though, Thalberg was an extremely cultured person, and this person, Izzy Itzkowitz, speaks nothing but kind of Jewish argot, And it was just kind of surprising to read and to see how prevalent and how out in the open that kind of stereotyping was. But I think Thalberg and Meir, this was just the cost of being an American. You know, I mean, they just, you know, that was the lay of the land.
Because of Thalberg's poor health, he'd been born with this congenital heart defect. You write about how he would take regular trips to this spa in Germany, and so he had an inkling of the Nazi threat in the 1930s, but he and Mayer didn't really call that out. They did not, and they didn't pull out of Germany because they had so much business there. I mean, was that just also their not rocking the boat, their survival instinct kind of kicking in?
It's a good question. I mean, it was a little different for each one of them. Mayer just was all about the company. MGM was like his alter ego, and he just, anything that wasn't good for the company, he wouldn't do. And I think he knew what was happening in Germany, but they had a lot of money there, and that's what mattered to him. He didn't want to hurt the company by taking a financial loss. And Thalberg, you know, there's an anecdote I found where, you know, that Norma Shearer told an actor, a friend of hers, that they were at one of these spas where they witnessed outside the window kind of an anti-Semitic riot, you know, a Nazi march. And Thalberg, who, as you said, was, you know, German Jewish parents, so he spoke fluent German, and Norma says he was telling me what the Nazis were saying. And so he saw firsthand what happened, but for whatever he felt that communism was a bigger threat than fascism. It's not clear why, you know, that's what he felt. So even though he saw this stuff, he didn't belittle it, but he felt, you know, communism is a bigger threat.
And of course he didn't live long enough to see what ultimately it
Exactly.
became.
Exactly.
This ties in, I think, to the fact that partly Mayer and Thalberg were quite conservative, you know, politically, and they were hardcore Republicans and involved in union busting. And one of the really fascinating parts of the book is you bring us into, you know, part of the reason why we have the Oscars and the Academy is union busting, and you get into some of the pressures they would bring to bear on their employees and trying to dissuade them from protest, from activity on behalf of the Democratic Party, and from organizing. Can you talk about researching that aspect of it?
Well, you know, I mean, again, you have to see people whole, you know, and Thalberg's writers had difficulty with this as well. You know, he was very close to his writers. Francis Marion is a key example, who was an Oscar-winning screenwriter, one of the top screenwriters of the 20s and 30s. But she believed, you know, when the Guild started to form, she was a key player in starting the Writers Guild. And Thalberg just absolutely, positively did not believe in unions for writers. He thought people were nuts. You know, he basically thought that they were going to ruin, everyone had a good deal here and they were going to ruin it. He said to someone, you know, you guys aren't plumbers. What do you want a union for? And he just, you know, it created it was hard for his writer. You know, it really shattered these close relationships, like with Francis Marion. I mean, they eventually achieved a kind of rapprochement, but it was never the same as before this. His resistance to unions really put a huge damper on his relationship with his writers. His writers, they just didn't get it, and he didn't get it. You know, it was like a non-meeting of the minds, and there's a lot of very sad stories of writers who just felt betrayed by Thalberg because he didn't believe in the Guild.
This is kind of tangential to that, but speaking of just kind of these often fractious relationships and things that we look at now as if it puts perhaps Mayer and or Thalberg on the wrong side of history. You write about, you know, writers like William Faulkner coming through the system and not having much success, and F. Scott Fitzgerald, who's an especially fascinating figure here. And one of the first things that Thalberg did was early in his career, relatively, was fire Erich von Stroheim. And so I'm just curious, there was kind of just, you spend a lot of time, I think, talking about the things they got wrong, or perhaps just the things that, you know, that decisions that may not hold up, but also in some ways turned out serendipitously, perhaps,
Yeah, they didn't, you know, there's a lot of quotes about sound pictures are just going to be, you know, there'll always be silent films, you know. We'll have sound pictures, but there'll be silent films too. And well, it turns out, no, we do not have silent films anymore. So they were not far seeing all the time. They didn't always know which horse to back. But it's interesting, was Stroheim, was really, that's a different situation because that's a situation where, for better or worse, Thalberg ran a system where he was in charge. And one of the things that's been pointed out, which is true, is that the directors at MGM, the really individualistic directors, did not want to work for MGM, and MGM, Thalberg and Mayer didn't want them. Theirs was a system where they were in charge. And for better or worse, that's the kind of directors they hired. There are exceptions. George Cukor is an excellent director, and he did really well there. But, they didn't. There was a long period, I forget how many years, when, they won a lot of Oscars, nominated for a lot of Oscars. I don't even know if it's just nominees or wins, but Best Director was not an area that MGM did well in.
It is fascinating you bring that up because it's sort of opposed to the kind of what we think of as auteurism or something, and directors with a really strong signature style. And I am curious to ask you is kind of, I guess, I know in the book you're sort of, it's Kenny, the film historian, as opposed to maybe the critic, although that's obviously, I think it's there, but I am just curious, is there a film besides Bombshell that stands out to you from this period as just a favorite that you found even more enjoyable on revisit than you thought or expected?
I find myself a big fan of Camille, the Garbo film, which is one of the very last films that Thalberg's mostly supervised, because that's like the best of the factory system. Garbo was in, every single one of her films was for MGM. And, because she didn't want to act, they basically, whatever she wanted, she got, because she is literally perfectly happy to go home to Sweden and never act again. So she would have them over a barrel. They couldn't really threaten her with anything. So she was able to just pick her projects and pick her directors, and she had Thalberg or David O. Selznick produce for her. And, they had all the great MGM craftspeople, good screenwriters, everything. And Thalberg contributed. There's a famous anecdote where, he has a story conference that's about, when at the very end where Armand and Marguerite are kind of planning their wedding. And Thalberg's note to the director was, have them play it like they're planning a crime. And if you see the film, you can kind of see that edge to it. And he was good at stuff like that,
Yeah. One last question before I open up to the audience. I know we have people who want to ask questions, but one of the pleasures of your book is seeing actors like Garbo and others almost before they were household names and coming up through as contract players, and Joan Crawford and Clark Gable, among many others. And it is, and we see some of this in Bombshell. Of course, the actors having no autonomy, no control over their careers, being loaned out. Elizabeth Taylor, calling themselves like MGM chattel, basically. And you do tell this very funny story about this happening to Clark Gable, which maybe it's worth, which worked. But it's
these things could backfire. At least the story goes. It's a fact that Gable was a big star at MGM. He was doing well, but he was making trouble. He thought he needed more money, and to punish him, Louis B. Mayer loans him out to Columbia. And what he loans him out to Columbia for is it happened one night. Yes. So rather than be a punishment, this turned out to be the making of his career. So this kind of stuff could backfire. It was not a good system for any of the creative people to work at MGM. They were well paid, but they had very little autonomy. They had to do what they were told to do. We as audiences benefited from the studio system, but I think the people involved, they were understandably not very happy.
Are there questions from anyone? Raise your hands high. Yes, I think we have some microphones going around. So I think up here in the back, yeah.
Yes, the actors seem to speak incredibly fast. Was there any reason for that? And the Marquis being the immigrant, was that part of the theme of the movie?
Say that last part again.
the marquee as being an immigrant and then being thrown out of the country. Was that part of their theme of the movie?
No, I think it looks that way to today's eyes. I think that was not on their mind at the time. Yeah, I mean, I think it's almost like people wanted to get their, these were talking pictures. It's still the relative early days of talking pictures, and people wanted to get their money's worth. A lot of words, and the actors came from Broadway, and they just wanted to show off. Lee Tracy is probably as fast talking a guy as ever made a sound film, and I just think they were kind of having fun.
Right here, yes. Sure. Yeah. Oh, here's a mic.
Probably a little trite, which is talking about. I would say two things. One is probably a little bit trite and mundane, but the treatment of women in that particular studio. I know that later on, certainly Marilyn Monroe felt that way. But anyway, that was one thing. And the other thing is, could you talk about, if you knew, the competition between the studios of that time? Thank you.
Yeah, the studios, they were very competitive. They wanted to earn more money. And at some point they wanted Oscars, but they were definitely competitive. I don't know, the treatment of women. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, Kenny, it's interesting. I was going to ask. I feel like especially now, when a lot of times when we hear Louis B. Mayer, we think of Judy Garland and I think just his terrible mistreatment of her, and which you touch on in the book. Your book addresses that, but it also, in characteristically nuanced fashion, addresses the complexity of that relationship and kind of the longevity of it too, between the two of them. And so, but yeah.
Yeah.
Down here. Yeah. Yes, sure. Yeah.
One is coming.
Patience. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, wonderful book and talk. I have a question about Victor Fleming as the director of the film tonight. But like you said, it's not a friendly place for directors at MGM. But he seemed to have carved out a certain amount of power as a director, maybe with relationships with Tracy and Gable. He's kind of a guy's guy director. But what allowed him that kind of freedom that directors normally weren't allowed at MGM, do you think?
That's a good question. I wish we both have a friend, a guy named Mike Schragow, who wrote the definitive book on Victor Fleming, who tried to be here tonight. I mean, I feel bad he's not here. I could call on him and he could tell you. Yeah, I mean, I think he got things done. The mayor always liked people who got things done. I mean, and he was very much of a... I mean, the person who was like the fastest worker on the lot was Willard Van Dyke, who was legendary for, like if the camera didn't fall over, they moved on, And Fleming wasn't quite that, but he was very hard worker. He knew what he was doing. He was no nonsense. He could do all kinds of movies, and I think they just found a place for him. I don't know. I think some of this ends up being personal, how much... when they were in meetings together, how much Mayer warmed to people, and if he liked them, then that was all that was necessary.
Any other questions? One up here, and then I think we have another one over. Mike's coming out. Maybe on. Yeah. Start there, and then we'll go to the next one.
I haven't read the book yet, but I really look forward to it. Wondering if you had seen the documentary Girl 27 made by David Sten about Mayer and his treatment of women.
I've read about that documentary. I have not seen it.
Oh boy, see that. It's free on YouTube, and it's really, really something.
I was wondering if you could speak to how little space in the movie resembles Howard Dietz, the publicity man at MGM.
Yes, he's probably more like, from what I've read, Howard Dietz, the MGM publicity was kind of split into two halves. There was Howard Dietz on the East Coast and Howard Strickland on the West Coast. And Howard Dietz was very urbane, sophisticated, and wrote lyrics, very famous lyrics to Hollywood movies. And Howard Strickland on the West Coast was more of a company man. And I think Space Hanlon is supposed to be more about Howard Strickland than Howard Dietz. At least that's my understanding.
I think we have time for one or two more questions. Does anyone have anything else? Yes, I think one more. How about here and then here? Sure. Sorry, front row.
Guy is getting a workout.
Still remember my question. And it's dropped out of my mind suddenly. So why don't we take the other question? It'll come back to me, I'm sure.
Sure.
The Last Tycoon, how accurate is that compared to your feelings of Thalberg, and why do you think Fitzgerald decided to do it?
That's a very interesting question. There's not really a clear answer. That's why it's such an interesting question. The Last Tycoon is Scott Fitzgerald's book based, without any apology on Thalberg. Monroe Starr, the leading, the protagonist of it is based, he made no bone. Fitzgerald made no bones about the fact that it was based on Thalberg. The book has gotten, well, I don't know which to answer first. The book has gotten so much has been read about the book. It can be a little difficult to really figure out where the book fictionalizes and where, what the reality of Thalberg is. Fitzgerald was fascinated by Thalberg, even though, as he said, when he died, he said, this man was no friend of mine. Thalberg was one of the people who helped end his career. So he was not a fan of him, but he said, I was fascinated by him. He just, as a novelist, he could sense that he was a great character, and but it's it's interestingly enough, it's the reality. What's interesting about the novel, as I read it more than once to be doing this, is that Raymond Chandler said it best. Raymond Chandler said, "This is a great novel when it talks about the movie business." It's true. It's one of the best novelistic descriptions of how 1930s Hollywood work you're going to find. And then Chandler said, when you deal with the romance, he's just another lonely guy with too much time on his hands. So, and really, the book does break down that way. The romantic parts are not that satisfying, but the day-to-day Hollywood business, which Fitzgerald knew intimately because he worked, on the lot until Thalberg probably helped end his career. That stuff is very accurate and totally fascinating still. But it's a little hard to tell. When the first biography of Thalberg was written by a man named Bob Thomas, and the Fitzgerald book was so on his mind that the whole first section of the biography deals with the Fitzgerald book. That's how. It was like it was the elephant in the room, and Bob Thomas said, I want to deal with it immediately. So that book has had a huge impact on how we see Thalberg, and I don't think we can escape from it. I don't know that we can imagine Thalberg absent that book.
I think we have time. Do you remember your question, sir? Thank you.
And it was relevant to Fitzgerald, too, which is sort of tragic, Fitzgerald going to MGM to make money because of all the debt he'd incurred. But I think Billy Wilder said the tragedy of Fitzgerald at MGM, it's like hiring a great sculptor to do plumbing, and he didn't know how to connect the effing pipes. And so it is kind of sad. But my question was about, and one of the things I love about the book and the whole equation, which I think Fitzgerald coined, is New York and LA, that you talk about Nicholas Skank as being so powerful, but almost unknown to the public. And that I think it's so ironic then when at the end of his career, Louis B. Mayer says to Skank in New York, it's me or Dory Sherry. And it's like, okay, it's Dory, you're done. Yeah. And the fact that the most powerful producer in Hollywood was an employee. and could be basically fired. And I don't think that ever occurred to Mayer. And I think, I think that's one of his tragedies is he didn't realize he wasn't the most expensive employee in the United States. And at one point, I think the most earned more money than anyone else. But what about Skank as sort of all those decades in New York in the front office, really having an incredible amount of power, but being unknown to the public? And in your research, Mr. Turan, did you run across new impressions about Skank?
Well, they really didn't like each other, right? Skank and Mayer. They were really. I mean, Mayer was well aware that Skank was the boss, but he chafed under that continually. Skank was always sending people out to work on the lot to be kind of spies, and Mayer and Thalberg would turn them, and they would have to send a new spy out. It was a very fractious relationship. They were not. They spoke on the phone frequently in an era. I don't remember if it was once a week or I think it was probably once a week in an era where transcontinental phone calls were not the regular thing. Just a lot of bad blood between them. Really, just didn't like each other. And I think Mayer knew. I think by the time he said that, Mayer was just fed up and he just didn't care anymore. But he would not have put himself in that position earlier, I don't think, because he knew that he would lose that. He was not the boss.
I think that is all the time we have for unfortunately. But thank you so much for your questions, Kenny. Congratulations,
Well,
and thank you for
Thank
being
you,
here.
Justin.
Thank you.